Hi, my name is Helene Landemore. I'm a political philosopher from Yale University, and I'm here to provide some critical and philosophical comments on the Icelandic experiment. I should say at the outset that I'm neither an expert on Iceland nor on constitution making per se, but I have some ideas about what makes political procedures good at delivering good decisions, good outcomes, and I think one of the key features is their inclusiveness. And what's particularly striking in the constitution-making process in Iceland was precisely the degree of inclusiveness. Even compared to what's considered the normative ideal of a constitution-making process in my corner of the academic universe, it's often presented as an hourglass-shaped process with a wide popular consultation upstream of the process, so with, for example, a referendum on values and norms, and a wide popular consultation downstream of the process with, again, a validating type of referendum, for example. But usually, it's assumed that the best case scenario for the drafting of the text itself is a situation in which a few select people, very competent people, proceed in relative insulation from the larger public and provide the draft. And I think what the Icelandic people tried to do was actually thicken the waist of the hourglass-shaped process as much as possible, turn it into this cylinder, so make it as maximally inclusive as possible. And they did so through at least three methods, one which involved different concepts. So one is the concept of openness, by trying to make people participate by lowering the barriers to entry and just making a lot of things accessible, like, for example, through the crowdsourcing moment, but also through descriptive representation. That is, when wide participation wasn't possible, they tried to at least involve a representative sample of the population. So they did so, for example, with a national forum that Finner talked about, which was randomly selected, or at least quasi-randomly selected. And finally, they did so through measures aimed at increasing the transparency of the process. And transparency, I would define it roughly as a window, if not a door, open on procedures, substance, and protagonists involved in the process. So it's a window rather than a door, because it doesn't mean that people can actually do anything or participate, but they can actually witness and look and scrutinize what is being done. So the transparency of the procedure has to do with how things are decided, how the agenda is set, how people are selected, how the protagonists are selected. The substance has more to do with the content of the draft, the kind of arguments that are discussed, the kind of disagreements that emerge during the deliberation. I'm thinking here of the actual draft of the process. And the protagonists, of course, who are the people in charge of drafting the text, and it's related to the question of how they were selected and so forth. So the classical example of a constitution-making process, which I'm going to contrast with the Icelandic process, is the Philadelphia Convention of 1787, where basically a bunch of white male locked themselves in a room and came up with a draft. And in fact, they came up with a draft that wasn't at all what they had been mandated for. Because they were mandated to reform the Articles of Confederation, but they scratched that and they just decided that they would actually write a constitution. So there was no transparency whatsoever about the purpose of what they were doing and how they were doing it, and we only had retroactive access to their disagreements, the procedure they used to solve disagreements, etc., and the arguments exchanged. So the secrecy was both a matter of constraint and a matter of choice. The constraint was that, of course, the technologies were not there. They had no TV, no social media, so of course there was no way to have even a one-way transparency to the outside world. But the other dimension was a question of choice. Some of the participants said that they needed to insulate their deliberation from outside passions and pressures. And there's something to be said for that, actually, because it is true that when you're constantly under scrutiny or watched, you're less free to change your mind or less free to try out what may seem like dumb ideas before you try them out. In the Icelandic process, by contrast, you had several elements of transparency at various stages of the process. So the first one was in the fact that the National Forum of 2010 was streamed on the internet, so an entire day of deliberation and exchanges were made available to the wider public, even though the process itself was closed because you had to be randomly selected to be able to participate in it. And there was also a dimension of vertical transparency in the drafting of the Constitution, since the public had access to the Constitutional Council's draft at various stages. And vice versa, the Constitutional Council member had access to public input and some of the thoughts of at least the people who showed up, which were unfortunately less than 1% of the population. And finally, you could say there was some degree of horizontal transparency in the fact that all the participants on the forums and on the social media had actually access to each other's thoughts and comments. Again, a remarkable and a very admirable difference with historical precedents. So this has led, for example, one of the Constitutional Council member, Thorvaldur Gylfason, if I'm not butchering that name, to say that he believed that this was the first time a constitution was being drafted basically on the internet. The public sees the constitution come into being before their eyes, and he emphasized the difference with previous constitution-making processes where constitution makers sometimes found it better to find themselves a remote spot out of sight, out of touch. And so presumably this was all for the better. Now, why transparency in the Icelandic case? Well, one was again a matter of technology opportunity. Social media were available at that point. And Iceland, as Finnur mentioned, has one of the highest internet penetration in the world and a very highly educated and digitally savvy citizenry. But it was also a matter of choice. Unlike the 18th century Federalists, they decided that post-2008 crisis, the Icelandic people decided that transparency was actually a good accountability mechanism, and they embraced the view that light is the best disinfectant and would avoid backroom deals and all sorts of shady things that can happen behind closed doors. I would, however, challenge the idea that nothing should have been changed in the process and that the transparency was full. Some of the critics have just mentioned that there was too little public justification of the procedural steps, of the time frame, of the role and selection method of various protagonists. For example, it's unclear why only 25 members were put on the council. It's not entirely clear why they were elected rather than randomly selected. There were all sorts of things that were just decided relatively unilaterally and by the Constitutional Council, I believe, and the Parliament maybe, but there was no public debate about any of the procedures. And even though you could celebrate the sort of organic way, even the Constitutional Council made some decisions, there also was a certain lack of just public justification as to why you divided into 3 groups, as to how you chose to, put forward 12 drafts rather than 20, and all sorts of things that could have been more transparent. And even in terms of the substance of the draft, you could say that yes, the text was put online at various points, but there was no access to the actual deliberation of the Constitutional Council, except through very long, somewhat opaque PDFs that were published with some delay after the meetings. So what would full transparency have required, assuming that this is indeed what we want, which I'm going to challenge in a minute? Well, you could have had a streaming of the Constitutional Council debates, for example, like on the model of what was done for the National Forum. There should probably have been more media coverage and critical analysis of the meetings and deliberation that took place, which would have enhanced the transparency of the decision process. And finally, some have also proposed that you could have tried something even more revolutionary, like a fully crowdsourced process where there would have been no Constitutional Council whatsoever, but purely, like a wiki page where everybody could come and just write down the suggestions. On the other hand, a case against some degree of transparency is that selective disclosure of information might be more efficient than instant access to every stage of the process. Because indeed, who really watches stream debates for an entire day? I'm told that Norwegians can watch a log burn for a very long time, but so maybe it's possible that Icelandic people have that kind of stamina, but probably it's better to have sort of moments of synthesis rather than complete access to everything at every time. And finally, a point that's rarely made is that there are conflicts of legitimacy in all this that were not discussed. So what is more legitimate, really? Transparent debates among a self-selected crowd that constitute less than 1% of the population, or semi-opaque ones among people who are actually elected, the Constitutional Council. So I think transparency should be kept in mind that transparency is not the only source of legitimacy. It's just one value among others, and maybe there are trade-offs here that we want to consider. So to conclude, I'll just raise some questions. What the experiment in Iceland suggests is that there are problems of scalability that have to be addressed by countries that want to emulate that process. It's unclear that you can apply this experiment in much more populous countries. For example, one issue is how do you deal with the amount of input from the crowd, right? Apparently, the Constitutional Council members managed to answer to almost all of those who were made, but clearly when past a certain threshold of a certain quantity of input, it's probably very hard to do that well. Then the argument from outside pressures and passions remains and retains some force. I just wanted to point out that while technologies make full transparency feasible, it's not entirely clear it's always desirable. And finally, transparency is a means to various ends. Accountability, certainly, but also inclusiveness, I've mentioned, but there are other ways to get there. So depending on what you favor most, you may have, again, to make some choices, and transparency might not be, in the end, the most important thing. Finally, in terms of the meaning of transparency itself, I think in the age of information overload and time scarcity, it can't be just making everything available at any time. It could be sort of publicity plus, making sure that the information you deliver is actually readable, usable, and it could be even compatible with maintaining some moments of opaqueness or of opacity or even secrecy, as long as the procedures framing that opacity are justified in a transparent manner themselves. And so that's why I would like to emphasize as a conclusion that we insist a lot about the transparency about substance and content, but there is, to me, a more important transparency that has to do with the transparency of the procedures. Thank you.